Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm Flory Lazier, President and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa, the leading U.S. business association focused solely on Africa and connecting business interests on the continent. I want to thank each of you for joining us for day 3 of our Leaders Forum on resilient U.S.-Africa business engagement to drive post-COVID-19 recovery. Yesterday, we had a very dynamic conversation on our session on the economic and health innovations in response to COVID-19. The session featured remarks from His Excellency Filipe Nyusi, President of Mozambique, and a high-level panel of private sector leaders and government officials who explored the innovative steps taken by African governments and the U.S. and African private sector to fight the pandemic and mitigate the effects of the economic downturn that's been caused by this pandemic. I'm grateful to all the African, U.S. government, and private sector leaders who shared their insights during yesterday's session, and to the public and private sector leaders who speak during today's session and the one to follow. Tomorrow is the last of our 4 days of the Leaders Forum. I'm also deeply thankful to our sponsors and media partners, AfroBridge, Afro Tourism, Caterpillar, Citi, Covington and Burling, Creative Associates, Development Finance International, Flutterwave, General Electric, Lockheed Martin, Procter & Gamble, Rabin Martin, and Visa, and to our media partners, All Africa, APO Group, and Jeune Afrique. Your support of this forum during these unprecedented times shows how committed you are to CCA and to strengthening and advancing U.S.-Africa trade and investment. Now, our session today, Resiliency in Action, Drivers of Growth in Post-COVID Africa, will highlight key sectors beyond health that are critical to post-COVID-19 economic recovery. We are definitely looking forward to a rich and insightful conversation among our high-level panelists who are playing, each of them, a critical role in addressing these issues. Now, I am delighted that Ms. Bonnie Glick, the Deputy Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, has agreed to offer opening remarks for this session of the Leaders Forum. Ms. Glick, we are honored to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us today, and let me thank you again for joining us during the event we had in New York this past fall during UNGA, on linking health and economic growth in Africa. That was a great session, and we thank you for being there with us, and again for coming today. Ms. Glick was most recently the Deputy Secretary of the Maryland State Department of Aging, where she was appointed by Governor Larry Hogan. Before that, she was in the nonprofit world at Meridian International Center, and also worked in the private sector at IBM. Ms. Glick began her career as a Foreign Service officer in the Department of State, where she served tours of duty at the U.S. mission to the United Nations during Operation Desert Shield, at the U.S. embassies in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and Managua, Nicaragua. She served on the staff of the Secretary of State's Operations Center, and then as a senior officer in the White House Situation Room, and then in the State Department's Bureau of Western Hemisphere. Ms. Glick holds a bachelor's in government and international relations from Cornell University, a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University, and an MBA from the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. Thank you so much again, Ms. Glick, for joining us, and over to you.
Go to that. Can you go to that thing? Flory, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for having me here with all of you today. It was great to be with you in New York, and I look forward to being able to see you and the rest of the Corporate Council on Africa in person soon. As we all know, recovery from COVID-19 depends on the creativity, efficiency, and ambition of our private sector. So it's so important that these conversations are taking place. From the perspective of USAID, we know that America has always been and will always be a country of bold action. We know that a threat to health security anywhere is a threat to health security everywhere. And that's why we are the world's largest provider of health and humanitarian assistance. In the 21st century alone, the US has contributed over $140 billion to maintain global health security around the world. In response to COVID-19, we've engaged in what we're calling our All of America effort. It includes all parts of American society, from government to NGOs, charities, and the private sector. To me, among the most extraordinary things to see is how corporations and companies and small manufacturers have all rallied to retool their standard operations to provide resources to combat the novel coronavirus. The liquor companies that are now making hand sanitizer, the electronics and motor companies that now make ventilators, the clothing manufacturers who now make masks and gowns. We're seeing this all across the world, and we're seeing it particularly in Africa. It's a remarkable sight to behold indeed. The US government has contributed more than $12.4 billion to combat COVID-19, which includes more than $1.3 billion in assistance from USAID and the State Department. That assistance is specifically aimed at fighting the pandemic in over 120 different countries. And that number does not reflect the generosity of private businesses, nonprofit groups, charities, faith-based organizations, and individuals, as well as the ingenuity of our scientists, researchers, and innovators. Together, these businesses and organizations have provided $4 billion in donations and assistance to combat COVID-19, accounting for nearly 80% of global philanthropic efforts. In sub-Saharan Africa, our US government contribution of assistance includes more than $361 million to meet the critical needs of communities, governments, and of course, the health workers on the front lines of the pandemic. In Nigeria, to name one example, USAID is providing more than $37 million of additional funding to help Nigeria respond to the pandemic. And we recently delivered 50 state-of-the-art US-made ventilators to South Africa, the initial delivery of our pledge of up to 1,000 ventilators, in order to assist in the South African national response to COVID-19. Those are just two examples of our response to the immediate needs of COVID-19 in Africa. We're working to scale up assistance and to prioritize the pandemic response in all of our programming across the continent. We're also looking at ways to use our assistance to catalyze private sector investment, because we know that private enterprise is the most powerful engine for lifting people out of poverty. It exemplifies what we mean when we say that the purpose of foreign aid should be to end the need for its existence. Countries are best able to provide for their needs of their citizens when there's a vibrant private sector in place locally. The private sector creates jobs and, by definition, revenues to the governments in the form of taxes. This cycle is one of sustainability, what we refer to as self-reliance. Our goal ultimately is to end the need for foreign assistance in a way that allows countries to be able to provide for their own citizens, to provide an environment in which private enterprise thrives and flourishes, and provides the conditions for communities that are peaceful and stable. In the wake of COVID-19, USAID is building on existing partnerships to align with the new market realities. We're adapting our programs to identify new market-based solutions. For example, in Ghana, we're partnering with local enterprises and factories that normally produce clothing and apparel, and we're taking the time to pivot to producing masks, medical gowns, and other personal protective equipment. Through Power Africa, we redirected more than $3.5 million to support healthcare facilities and utility companies to cope with the impact of the pandemic on access to electricity. And through the Prosper Africa initiative, we're substantially increasing trade and investment between the US and Africa, harnessing the power of the private sector to drive shared economic growth and prosperity. Prosper Africa, as everyone knows, will play an important role in blunting the economic impact of COVID-19 by ensuring that American businesses in Africa can continue to support local workers, keep exports flowing, and stabilize investment. So let me make a point that too often is overlooked. Foreign assistance is not just a numbers game. It's not just who has written checks, how much they're for, and who they're written to. Foreign assistance is a reflection of a nation's core principles and values. America's foreign assistance has always been designed to promote national sovereignty, prosperity, democratic governance, and individual rights. In contrast, the Chinese Communist Party's foreign assistance is reflective of their values, and it has very little to do with development and a whole lot to do with intimidation, influence, resources, and the projection of power. USAID offers a journey to self-reliance, while Beijing promotes a journey to dependence on China. And we're seeing this most clearly on the African continent. As we look beyond the short term, we know that COVID-19 will continue to have an extraordinary impact around the world for years to come, long after the pandemic phase subsides. In light of this, USAID is looking at the next order impacts of COVID-19. This over-the-horizon review will ensure that our investments around the world are well positioned to be effective in a post-outbreak world. While we continue to lead the global response to the immediate impacts of COVID-19, we're also preparing for the lasting changes to the economic, development, and humanitarian landscape that we will all see. And with sustained engagement with the private sector, we will lay the necessary groundwork for longer-term economic growth, prosperity, and self-reliance. So with that, Flory, thank you so much for the opportunity to join you all here today. It's always an honor to be with the Corporate Council on Africa. Thank you so much, and best wishes for the rest of this conference.
Thank you so much, Ms. Glick, for your generous time that you gave to us today, for the insightful remarks that you made on the role of AID and the U.S. government more broadly in supporting Africa during the pandemic and in ways that relate to both health and beyond health, the economic recovery. So thanks again for being with us. We appreciated having you here. Now we're going to transition to our high-level panel discussion, which I'm sure will be really interesting as the ones the previous days of the Leaders Forum have been. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this session, Dr. Ache Leke, Senior Partner, Johannesburg Chairman of McKinsey Africa. Before I turn it over to Ache, I just want to provide some information and housekeeping rules for the question and answer period. Please use the Zoom chat function to send us your questions. We look forward to asking them should time permits. We've got a great panel, and so I'm sure they will take up a lot of time sharing information with us, but we'd like to take some of your questions as well. So please submit them through the Zoom chat function, and we will only take questions from those who have provided their names, first and last name, and your affiliation. So please remember when you're entering your questions in the chat to say who you are and who you're with. So Ache, over to you.
Thank you, Flory, for that introduction. Thanks for the invitation to moderate this panel today, this afternoon, Joburg time, morning, US time. And just some context. So we're doing this in a time where Africa is about to hit 350,000 COVID cases, right? We woke up to about 330,000 cases this morning. And we're starting to see an exponential uptake in quite a few of our countries, right? At some point, there were big debates as to whether we would see it or not. But having said that, we have to balance, saving lives and safeguarding livelihoods. And so we've had to start to reopen our economy. So many of our economies are starting to reopen, some slower than others, but starting to reopen in a context before we hit the peak, right? So unlike other countries where we reopen after they've hit the peak, here we're reopening before we hit the peak. And so it's very important, and we're seeing many of our public sector and private sector leaders needing to grapple with this whole idea about how do I focus on resolve and resilience, resolving the crisis, but also how do I think about return to work and how do I reimagine what Africa could look like going forward. And so this session today is really focused more on the whole return and reimagining, right? Thinking through how can some key sectors, and we'll talk about our panelists today, they represent many of these sectors, how could they contribute to driving growth in a post-COVID world, growth and recovery across the continent? And as McKinsey, we had actually done some research on this to look about, to think about how do we reimagine Africa. We had interviewed about 20 or so leaders across the continent to really understand how they think about reimagining Africa. I just wanted to share, a few of the lessons we learned from them. So we came up, we identified about 9 bold ideas to reimagine Africa. And some of these ideas is what we're going to unpack in the session today. One is about how do you reimagine society? And within that, we think, digital, and we're going to talk a lot about that today, I'm sure, how digital is really going to transform Africa and how the crisis is really an impetus to accelerate Africa's digital transformation. The second thing the crisis has also made us aware of is the plight of the urban vulnerable populations. A lot of focus in the past had gone into really helping the rural vulnerable, sort of the smallholder agricultures, farmers, and now we're starting to see more and more focus and figure out how do we support urban vulnerable, because we've seen how they struggled through the crisis. The third on society is the healthcare sector, right? A huge call for action to transform Africa's healthcare sector to make sure it's more resilient and more equitable going forward. So that's on society. On business, and we're starting to see it already, sector competitiveness, strengthening consolidation in different sectors. The market structure of these sectors will look very, very different again, and huge opportunities for huge risk, but also big opportunities for companies that we call resilience who win coming out of this. Fifth is manufacturing, right? We think there's a huge opportunity through the crisis to reshape Africa's manufacturing and focus on self-reliance, to reshape it to focus really on self-reliance and make sure that we manufacture more products locally, as we've seen what has happened with some of the imports that have been banned. And then the sixth on the business side is really formalization of our economies. A lot of SMEs are really struggling. The 90 million SMEs in Africa, only 15% or so are registered, and they're struggling, and they're the most vulnerable. right? And so, and a lot of the stimulus packages that have gone in have gone to help those that are registered. So how do you use this opportunity to really encourage SMEs to formalize over time? And we think, the winners, countries that win in that space could actually do a good job there. And then finally, there's an opportunity to reimagine government, right? So one is we believe there will be a much more active involvement in government in the economy going forward. It's very clear that's going to happen, but also a better partnership between government and the private sector. The private sector has played a key role in supporting government across Africa in addressing the crisis. And so we see there's a lot more trust now, and so there's a much better partnership we think can emerge out of this between government and the private sector. There's a contract between citizens and government, right? We think citizens have really come to realize that the importance of governments. They decide if your kids can go to school, they decide if you can leave your house. And so we think there'll be a stronger contract. Citizens will think more now about who they actually elect into office. But also as governments have put out packages to really support vulnerable, and many of these packages didn't exist because we didn't have social safety nets in many of our countries. We think there could be some expectations coming out of this from our citizens. So how are we going to continue to support the most vulnerable? And the last one is Pan-African cooperation. We've seen the continent really step up and unite to address this crisis. And we think there's a lot of momentum here to strengthen regional and Pan-African cooperation. Those are just a few ideas coming out of this. But to help me unpack this, let me invite my panel to turn on their videos and the audio so I can introduce them and we can actually get going with the discussion. So first panelist we have is Dr. Sarah Alade. She's a special advisor to the President of Nigeria on finance and the economy. So welcome, Dr. Alade. We also have Mohammed Dorish, who's a co-founder of IHS Towers and the CEO of IHS Nigeria. We have Aida Diarra, who's a senior vice president and group country manager for Sub-Saharan Africa for Visa. And last but not least, Karim Sinhaji, who's the CEO of OCP Africa. So that's a great panel. We will, again, I'll start with a few questions to the panel. And then if you please send your questions as requested so we can then make sure they answer as many of your questions as we can. So Dr. Alade, maybe let me start with you. Nigeria in particular, like many African countries, has been quite hit by the crisis. We know this morning there were about 22,000 cases in the country. We know the country is probably going to go into another recession this year. Can you just give us a bit of a sense of how badly hit has the economy been because of the crisis?
Thank you, Achal. Unfortunately, we have been hit in many fronts. The health issue is one. That's the direct impact of the COVID-19 itself in terms of illness, death. You're just mentioning the numbers that we have, which is still, we haven't been able to flatten the curve yet. And this has put a lot of pressure on our weak healthcare system. The healthcare system, could be better, is weak. And then we have all these other expenditure too, in order to contain the pandemic. Secondly, the response of government to the pandemic in terms of restricting movement has also affected households. It's affected livelihoods. People cannot go to work. We have a large informal sector that depends on working daily for what they used to support their families. Now they cannot do that. So we have a lot of households that have lost income. And this definitely has contributed to the unemployment that we have in the country. Then lastly, the global spread of the pandemic also led to the lockdown. And that has, resulted in the collapse of oil prices. And Nigeria is largely dependent on oil. So with the collapse of oil prices, which is the main earner of our foreign exchange and the major contributor to government revenue, the fiscal of government, the revenue is in trouble, so to say. Federal government revenue had dropped from 8.4 trillion naira and now to about 5.6, about 30% drop. We haven't seen the end of it yet. So we are just hoping that it will not be too bad. We are also expecting that the GDP will contract by about 4%. So we have all these, being hit on all sides, so to say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. We always say, we think about one crisis when we talk about the corona crisis, but it's actually three crises, right? So there's a global pandemic, and that, the way it manifests itself, like you said, it's, our imports, disruption of our imports, but also lower demand for our exports. Like you said, oil from Nigeria, but it could be cocoa from Ghana or cars from Morocco or flowers from Kenya. There's the Africa pandemic with the lockdowns, like you said, huge reduction in household and business expenditure, but also it's affected tourism. Tourism is 8.5% of Africa's GDP. And in some island states like the Seychelles, it's 40% of GDP. And then there's the oil crisis. I remember I heard the Minister of Finance talk about how oil receipts were projected to go down by 90% in Nigeria, where oil accounts for about 60% of government revenue, right? So fundamentally affected indeed. We'll come back again to what Nigeria is doing about that. But let's move to Mohammed. Mohammed, you're actually in the sector, the telco sector, that generally people feel has not been that affected. We're all working from home, we're all using tons of data. Can you talk a bit about how affected has, your company IHS been? By the way, what does IHS do? But also how affected has the telco sector been in general across Africa?
Sure, Asha. So first, thanks for CCA for organizing this event, and also my regards to my fellow panelists as well as you, Asha. So IHS, we are a telecommunication infrastructure provider. We own and operate around 30,000 telecom towers across Africa, Middle East, and Latin America. And probably around half or more than half are located in Nigeria. So you are right that no sector of the economy has been spurred by COVID. While many developed countries are recovering from the worst of the pandemic, as you said, we unfortunately fear that Africa seems to be going through the peak now. When one sees the devastating impact of lockdown on the economies of the developed countries, you can just imagine how much worse it will be on Africa and countries like Nigeria, given the lack of financial might. So, even though the IMF estimates that Nigeria's GDP will shrink by 5%, Dr. Sarah mentioned maybe 4%, but when you see their estimates for the US to be 8%, for Europe to be more than 10%, you really wonder if the impact on Africa and Nigeria will unfortunately be worse than this. So in reference to what Dr. Sarah said, yes, I mean, with the crash in oil prices, shortage of dollar inflows, compounded by the pandemic, a lot of sectors were badly hit, oil and gas, FMCG, to even manufacturing, which require access to dollars for importation of raw materials. So unless and until African economies diversify from reliance on natural resources, we will remain a dollarized economy that import most of what we consume, and the health of our economies will be determined by the fluctuations of the natural resources prices. So back to your question, during the pandemic, there has been slow invoice demand, but the uptake has been great on the data. The key challenges that the sector saw was disruption maybe in supply chain, access to dollars in certain economies in Africa, and slightly degradation in the security situation due to the lockdown, where you see a lot of people have lost their main source of income. So while a lot of companies, their staff could afford to work from home, other companies like IHS, we had a big number of our staff who had to be on the field to go around the network and watch out for it, which I send my warm regards to. So despite the challenges I have mentioned, the ICT sector is playing a key role in promoting resilience during this period. So let me end by saying that, Asha, the concept of social distancing we are hearing recently is an anathema to who we are as humans. It's a contrary to what we are. So the ICT sector played a role enabling people to stay connected despite the forced separation. Two, providing an alternative to the halted transportation sector, to enabling organizations to continue with their business, keeping people connected, let them speak, chat on videos, etc., and so on. And even posing a lot of big questions like, do we rethink the way we work post this pandemic, given the facilities that the ICT sector has provided. 3, enabling education sector to continue through online means. To be honest, I didn't enjoy it with my kids much, but to be fair, at least the online education ensured that they continue to get their studies. 4, probably Ida will speak better to this, but the platforms created by the ICT is what enabled financial services, e-commerce to flourish. Look at the Amazons of this world, what they have done to make sure that people's needs remain intact and sourced during this period. And lastly, I would say the health sector that Dr. Sarah mentioned, the telemedicine was critical in reducing non-emergency hospital visits so as to not to overwhelm the already congested health facilities, which is something that we at IHS, for example, has greatly used.
Yeah. No, thanks, Mohammed. I do have one more question, but it's funny because, one of my clients told me, during this crisis, before the crisis, all the countries and we all realized the importance of the financial services sector. With the crisis, we've really realized the importance of the telecom sector, right? So you talked about, throughout the crisis, some of your staff had to work. It'd be interesting to understand what percentage of your staff actually continued working and what did you do to help protect them, while they're working in the lockdown?
So, all of us, we were continued to work. I would say 60, 70%, actually more. So we employ around 40,000 in direct and indirect staff across our operations. I would say the vast majority remain working on the field to go around the network, while the remaining were working from home for the administration departments and so on and so forth. So for these guys on the field, it was very important to make sure that HSE, safety, health is very protected for them in terms of providing them with PPEs, equipment, continue the education tour with them, that what they have to do to make sure that they are not exposed to the virus. A lot of online training we did as well for them, just to make sure that they are away from those concerns. So as I said, unlike other companies, we did not have the luxury really to work at home, and a big number of those staff had to go through the exposure with the outside world during this. But education, as I said, was mostly important. That's how you educate people to keep hygiene, social distancing, while we had to provide them with all sorts of PPE tools to ensure their safety.
No, thank you. And of course, when I said continue to work, I meant, of course, work in the field, right? I think, many of us, unfortunately, are working much harder than we did, when we're not working from home. Actually, another client of mine told me it feels less like working from home, but more like sleeping at the office. So you got to figure out how you avoid that. Let me turn to Ida. You mentioned Ida. Ida, let's talk about payments, right? That's the space Visa is in. And on one hand, people will say the crisis has accelerated the shift to electronic payments, right? People don't want to use cash anymore. People are trying to, and you could even go out, right? So a lot of electronic payments. On the other hand, we've talked about the lower economic activity, the job losses, right? We project that they could be up to about 30% of all jobs in Africa could be at risk. So these losses have clearly led to a contraction in payment revenues. So how has Visa been affected? How has the payments, the financial services, the payment space been affected by the crisis in Africa?
Thank you, Acha. It's certainly a pleasure for me to be on this panel with you and my co-panelists. And, as it has already been said, COVID-19 has disrupted economies and societies in ways that, no one could have anticipated that. I'd like to share with you and the panel probably three trends that we've seen in the payment industry. The first one has to do with, to your point, with consumers not being in a position to go to retail stores and being confined at home. We've seen a surge of e-commerce transactions happening online. We've done a survey not too long ago with consumers, and in markets like Kenya, 54% of consumers we've talked to have told us, this is the first time throughout, the crisis that we've used food delivery online. The same survey was done in Kenya and in Nigeria, South Africa. South Africa, the number was 37% of new people, consumers trying for the first time ordering from the net. And that number was 42 from Kenya. This is just to indicate that there certainly has been a trend towards e-commerce. Some of the retailers have even told us that they've seen an increase up to 400% of their e-com or web activity compared to pre-COVID-19 crisis. So there is an indication then that the transactions and the payments are going online. And the very interesting part, by the way, is that all of them we talked to said that even after the crisis, they will continue to transact online. So that's trend number one. The second trend that we've seen is, as we engage with merchants in Central Europe, Middle East, and Africa, 80% of the merchants have told us that they've seen a spike in their contactless transactions. And for us, this is an indication that we have a unique opportunity to accelerate this technology. Consumers and merchants are looking for easy ways to transact, and this is definitely one other way to do it. And probably the third trend that I will mention is, with the usage of mobile wallets and mobile money, we are in a unique position to innovate and provide new solutions for payment, and especially in the context of P2P transactions, person-to-person transactions. So definitely challenges across the industry, but at the same time, we are seeing new opportunities arising. And we believe that it is a unique time to digitize payments throughout the continent.
No, thank you. I fully agree. Part of we just published a report you may have seen on the impact of COVID on payments and exactly what you found. And that speaks to the first trend I talked about, acceleration of digitization. So we'll come back to talk a bit about, what you're doing to make that happen as part of Visa. But thank you for that. Karim, let's turn to you, right? As we know, agriculture is a bedrock of the African economy. It accounts for close to a quarter of our GDP, as a continent. Roughly sounds like we export, about the latest numbers we saw was $40 billion worth of food and agriculture products out of the continent. But on the other hand, we also import about $50 billion worth of food and agriculture product, right? So would love to understand from you, how has the crisis affected the ag sector and how has it affected OCP?
Thank you, Asha, for your question. I would like also to thank the CCA team for the invitation and my warm regards to my fellow panelists. First of all, I would like maybe to give a brief presentation of OCP Group and its African subsidiary, OCP Africa. So our company has a century of experience in the phosphate industry. OCP is integrated across the entire phosphate value chain, from mining to processing and marketing phosphate and its derivatives, mainly fertilizer. And today, OCP is one of the world's largest fertilizer company, and the only major one whose operation and home are based in Africa. So OCP Africa was created in 2016, and from that date, let's say, the group displayed several actions and programs for the benefit of farmers by contributing to the development and the implementation of integrated agricultural ecosystems. And in partnership with a network of partners, including governments, non-profit organizations, companies, OCP works continuously to provide agricultural solutions to farmers that are locally relevant and sustainable. So today, OCP Africa is present over than 18 African countries through the opening of subsidiaries or representative offices and projects. And we also promote the production of competitive fertilizer in the major agricultural pools. So coming back to your question, Asha, one could say that Africa is facing many daunting challenges with big repercussions on its socioeconomic development. We have a growing population expected to double by 2050, reaching 2.5 billion inhabitants. And these demographic trends will create tensions on food security in the continent, as well as challenges in the job market. More unemployed youth will seek jobs and opportunities out of their communities and countries, resulting in regional migration, particularly from rural to urban areas. The climate change is also impacting the continent at a disproportionate rate, and the International Food Policy Research Institute estimate that the continent will add an additional 38 million hungry people by 2050 due to the climate change. And as far as the COVID-19 pandemic is concerned, it has a severe impact on the continent and has exposed the limits of our current approaches. In most African countries where the food system are labor intensive, the shortage of workers due to restriction on the mobility of people has compromised both necessary input supply on the upstream and trade, processing, and transport activities on the downstream level. And as you mentioned, our dependence on extra-regional food imports, and by the way, it's over than $50 billion, it's $70 billion that we are importing as a finished good. And what we are exporting is mainly raw materials. And that situation that has made our countries more vulnerable to disrupt international logistic and distribution channels. So the issue we have faced, for instance, in Brazil or in Russia, that has a huge impact in Africa because we will not be able to import any more wheat and rice for a short period of time. And then we have seen the prices that just flow up. And these impacts actually are just further exacerbate a situation that is already characterized by a high prevalence of malnutrition and poverty. And this is due to problems in mainly rural areas, including locust infestation, drought, conflict, and insecurity. So once again, I mean, this COVID-19 impacts, it was on food security, it was on employment, especially for the youth people, because when you look at the African job market, our economies are generating only 2 million formal jobs per year, where we have an estimated 12 million youth entering the workforce in Africa every year. So we need to build resilience models. We need to build resilience economy in order to ensure that Africa's developed achievements are not lost when disasters or disruption hit the continent. And to finish, this crisis has also changed the paradigm and triggered the need for a deep socio-economic reform in Africa and new development models. Models that will foster the diversification of our economies, boost the continental market, like the Africa Free Trade Area, and more especially promote innovation and digitalization as a trigger of the growth in Africa.
Perfect. Thank you, Karim. We'll come back and unpack many of those points in a bit. Maybe Dr. Alade, let me come back to you and let me encourage all of our guests to feel free to again include your questions in the chat function so we can actually come to your questions. While waiting for that, Dr. Alade, we talked about the impact of the crisis on the Nigerian economy. We know Nigeria has actually now launched an economic sustainability plan. Could you just talk a bit about some of the key elements of the plan? What are the priorities of the plan? How are you going to finance it? And what are you focusing on in the plan to really relaunch the economy? Dr. Alade, are you there? Oh, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So thank you very much. The Economic Sustainability Plan has as its main objectives the stimulation of the economy by preventing business collapse. I mean, the whole idea is that whatever businesses we have, we want to ensure that they continue to produce. We also intend to create jobs using especially labor-intensive methods. And when we talk about that, you're looking at agriculture. When you look at the number of youths that we have, you know that creation of job must be a priority, you know, post-COVID or even while we are going through the COVID thing and trying to solve the problems. We also intend, the sustainability plan also intend to spend a lot on infrastructure. It's not enough to get out of the health issue, and then we are not able to contribute to economic growth. So the infrastructure in the areas of job creation, those sectors that we enhance growth, the sustainability plan is planning to spend a lot on that. Promotion of local manufacturing is another, so that to some extent the country can be sufficient in some of the items that we need. We all have spoken about what happened to imports. Imports were locked. You can't import your healthcare items that you need because every other country needs it. And now this is one lesson, like you said, Acha, that we have learned that to some extent we should be self-sufficient in some of these items that we need. So promoting local manufacturing is another. And protecting the poor and the vulnerable in the society. This is also one of the priorities of the plan, so that those who are really not able, those who are affected, the worst affected people in the society can be promoted. Funding is estimated that it will be about 2.3 trillion naira. That's about $6 billion, I suppose. And it will be coming from the banks and coming from some government special accounts. And it's also, the sustainability plan also has a framework for implementation. So it's not just going to be paper ideas. It's going to be a plan that will be implemented. And that implementation will have, it has a very robust implementation framework headed by ministers of ministries. They will see to the implementation. We have project monitors, a combination of government as well as private sector teams to be able to monitor. You have monitoring and evaluation teams. The budget office will also be involved in the monitoring of these projects to ensure that expenditure is both transparent and out there for all to see. So the sustainability plan takes care of some of the concerns that we have been discussing today. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thanks. Maybe one follow-up question, because as part of this plan, I would love to hear a bit more on the SME front. We know SMEs are sort of the heart of many economies. Of the 90 million SMEs in Africa, about half of them, about 45 million, are in Nigeria, right? And so would love to understand, and those are the most vulnerable. So you talked about how you're protecting the vulnerable populations. We'd love to understand a bit more, how does this plan really help the SMEs in Nigeria?
We have a lot of, fiscal measures to help the MSMEs, and that's why I started by saying that one of it is to protect jobs. They have a lot of things from our Finance Act 2020. They have a lot of, there's a loan for MSMEs that we have. They can access loans. The sectors that have been badly hit, for all those micro and small enterprises can access loans. There are loans that are, supporting them, that is put out there by central bank and then by the banks to be able to access funds to ensure that their businesses do not die. We also have loans for those even in the healthcare system to be able to set up businesses and so on. And they have a lot of tax measures that they could also enjoy. The focus had been on encouraging MSMEs, really, those who have the jobs to retain their jobs and then to create more. That's one of the things that the sustainability plan tends to do.
Great, that's great to hear, because we know the MSMEs, especially the ones in Nigeria, need quite a bit of help. So it's great to hear that there are a number of programs in place to support them. Mohammed, let's come back to you then on the telco space. You know, we talked about now the real importance of this sector for economies. You know, what if you now project forward? Let's start looking more forward, right? Think about, you know, reimagining what this sector could look like around the crisis. What's your outlook for the sector? What would it take for it to emerge even stronger and to actually continue to support the growth of other sectors across our economies?
So, you know, my view of the future of the telecom sector is the same pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. Simply put, very positive. I mean, if I can just take us like 20 years back to when the private sector, to when the telecom sector was privatized in Nigeria, a lot of people said the growth would be 5 years and then we saturate. And I do remember a story that a license was offered to an international operator to come into Nigeria, and they turned it down, believing that in 5 years, 10 years, that the Nigerian telecom market is a 5 million subscriber people. Look where we are right now. So crowded, 200 million, 160 million subscribers, and the growth is still phenomenal and massive. And when I remember 20 years ago, and when people saying this is a 5-year, 10-year thing, we are 20 years now, and we are still nowhere close to where we are supposed to, it tells me that the future is still bright. So, for example, the World Economic Forum has also predicted that by 2022, 60% of the world's economy would be driven online. So COVID is only going to increase that percentage. If I look at the telecom sector in Nigeria, again, I think it was probably the only sector that was growing during the recession and among the best performers post the recession. But then that's again attract its own issues of multiple taxation and this and that, but that's for another discussion. So I've already outlined, for example, how the ICT sector enables other sectors. So the policy environments that will enable and strengthen the telecom sector will also deliver significant results in the other sectors and the digital economies of the future. So this term digital economy that you even touched based on, Aisha, in your starting remarks. So it's basically conducting most economic activities through online connections between people, devices, data, and the implication of that transformation will really go beyond to include social interactions, education, governance, and as I said before. So we can achieve all of that by improving broadband connectivity, 5G, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. I saw one question was asking about AI, cloud computing, and the list goes on and goes on. And each one of these things is really a word by itself. So, for example, while other countries started deploying 5G, we in Africa don't even have proper 4G coverage. Not even to talk about a lot of people in rural areas and rural villages who don't even have a basic phone coverage in those areas. Take IoT, for example. Imagine a world that is fully connected, every machine talking to every other machine, and them making decisions on their own without really involving us in that process. How do you ensure education gets to these millions and tens of millions of children across Africa who unfortunately probably 2/3 are girls? You do that by online education. How do you improve agriculture? Like what Karim mentioned before, we, for example, we install units on our sites that actually gather a lot of weather reports that we share with the farmers in Nigeria. Imagine if that is an automated system. Imagine that the farmers have that information automatically and they make their own decisions based on that. And those decisions are also automated in terms of the process. Women, people with disabilities, and starting their own SMEs. You've spoken about SMEs, and that's a very important thing for Africa. Most of businesses in Africa are SMEs, and that's where a big part of the employment is driven. Those 2-3 people, the neighbors who start a small shop, or they start a photo session, or they want to sell some products like for IHS. We see a lot of people even in IHS who knock our doors 2, 3, 4 people who want to build a site here, who want to provide some material in, for example, Borno State and in that area, who want to provide security situation there. So, and the beauty about these SMEs is that sometimes they are localized, so they understand the environment, they understand the terrain, they provide you better service, they have that energy that they want to make it, they want to prove themselves, they still have their energy, you see. So sometimes in IHS, I feel, it's better for us to deal with such people because they provide you with focused services, they provide you with the energy and the attention. Can Africa go there? Can we get to artificial intelligence? Can we get to IoT? Can we get to 5G? All of these, definitely we can. Who will get us there is the IC sector, is everybody. But how do we get there? In my mind, 2 things needed. Number 1, investment in the sector is needed and investment is available. Aisha, for example, we IHS, a infrastructure provider in Africa, have invested more than $5 billion over the past 5 years in this continent. But for that money to come and that money to be abundantly available, we need an enabling environment. We need an environment where government policies are made to protect businesses and ensure their sustainability. Then businesses will do the work. There have been few talk this session about private sector and privatization. If I look at the power sector in Africa, if I look at the roads situation in Africa, if I look at the aviation sector in Africa, if I look at the healthcare, the education, all of these, they need an overhaul. Look at the telecom sector in Nigeria, see what it has accomplished by privatization, the right way of privatization. So what I believe is opportunities is there. Africa has the potential. Africa can be where we are supposed to be. Investment is there. A lot of people are willing to put that money in Africa, but I think we just need to create that enabling environment that protect businesses and investments that would encourage people to really come. I have been in Africa for 20 years and I don't have plans of leaving that place because the opportunities are there. You just need to have a balance between the risk and return for such transactions.
So thank you. So talking about, telecom as an enabling sector, I like that, right? And enabling all the other ones, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's agriculture. And for that to happen, you said, investment and enabling environment, right? Those are the 2 things that need to happen. So we'll come back to that. Aida, let's talk about the payments again, the payments space, right? With the crisis, and in particular, we've spoken a lot about SMEs. We've spoken a lot about SMEs. They're the most vulnerable, as we know. So what specifically, and I know Dr. Alade spoke even about the programs the government has, but what, from your vantage point, and you deal with a lot of these SMEs, what can be done, best done to support them, right? And what role is Visa playing in this area?
Thank you, Asha. And to your point, I echo everything that has been said around SME in Africa. They play a key role in our economy. They represent 90% of businesses in Africa. We refer to them as representing 38% of Africa GDP. And from our perspective, we really need to have a collective role in empowering and creating resilience for SMEs in the region. In normal times, SMEs will tell you, 60% of them will tell you that their biggest challenge is to have access to finances. This is in normal times, pre-COVID-19. Now think about the impact that this crisis has had on them. So at Visa, we believe that we need to work with all the stakeholders in the payment ecosystem to make sure that we enable them to remain resilient. And in order for them to get there are certain critical factors. Yeah. So first, there's got to be an environment that is conducive of innovation, especially in the domestic payment ecosystem, just to make sure that all partners can join forces to drive innovation at that level. So I believe this is like the first step. The second critical element is really all what the governments are doing, and Dr. Alade talked about it. It's about, what is happening with the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement that, for example, enable e-commerce. This is fundamental. It's also about formalizing the SMEs and giving them a chance to enter the formal ecosystem and enabling the digital payment service providers to onboard them. This is going to be key moving forward. So at Visa, we've made a commitment to be part of the journey and play a critical role in that digitalization. We believe that number one, it is critical to make sure that these businesses have access to resources to enable them to go online, to digital. How do I bring my business online? Because this is the trend that we're seeing across the industry. Started before COVID-19, it has just accelerated during this time. And we're making these resources available to them on our small businesses hub. The second thing that we believe is important is to remind consumers that they are empowered to support their local businesses as well. So we launched a Where You Shop Matter campaign across several markets in the region and really remind consumers that they have a responsibility and they are empowered again to positively impact the business in their local environments. And then we want to make sure that, with the support of the foundation, we partner with NGOs and also with investor, in investing companies to really bring capital to support small businesses. And we've pledged to make a $200 million commitment and support to SMEs across the globe over 5 years. And with all the elements that I shared with you earlier, we believe that we will be able to enable 50 million SMEs across the globe and really empowering them to enter the digital journey. It is a commitment that we all should have. And it's going to take, again, working with the banks, working with the fintechs, working, leveraging the MNOs and the support of the governments as well to make sure that we embark into that digital journey and we accelerate it. You have markets like Seychelles, for example, who have made the decision to increase the limit of contactless transaction without PIN, just because they saw how critical it was to foster digital transaction. And this is only one example. And more than ever, we're ready to be part of the journey and be a catalyst of that trend.
Awesome. So thank you for the role you're playing, because I think this is actually critical. We are actually doing some work with AUD and NetPad and EcoBank and a number of stakeholders around trying to come up with a bold response for MSMEs across Africa, right? And as we think about it, we think the three things they need, there's access to markets, there's access to capabilities, and there's access to finance. And it's great to see that your program really touches on all of these three. So thank you for that. Karim, let me come to you, and then the number of questions from the audience, we'll start taking those. You talked about some of the challenges on the access. You talked about, the challenges even importing wheat and rice on the continent. We'd love to understand, what's your outlook for the sector going forward, and what do we need to do to come out of this with a much stronger agriculture sector for the continent?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, agriculture is a key lever to build resilience. And I already said that we need a resilient model. And if we want to generate growth and achieve food security, agriculture is really the key lever. And fortunately, our continent agriculture has a tremendous potential. Actually, Africa holds 65% of the world and used arable land. And we have also ample water supplies in many parts of the continent. And more importantly, we have over than 60% of Africa labor force, which is employed in agriculture. But on the other side, our agriculture is facing many obstacles to its development. And as I said earlier, new models adapted to the continent's specificities are essentials. Those models must ensure an increase in the agricultural productivity through ensuring access to affordable, good quality input, customized and locally produced, such as fertilizer or seeds, as well as raising awareness on good agricultural practices and digitalization. My fellow panelists have talked about that. Digitalization is one of the key success factors if we want to transform our agriculture, and I will talk about it later on. Those new models will have also to support local transformation of agricultural outputs for more value creation and promoting short food secrets. We have seen during this pandemic that many developed countries, maybe not related to the food, but for other products such as the mask that they need to protect themselves, they were all dependent on the production in China. And many others think we have seen during this pandemic is also correlated to that. So being able to produce, at least when it comes to food, to produce locally, this is also something essential. And those new models that we need to design and develop, they need to ensure, we have to make sure that they will support the local transformation. You have also mentioned the importance of SMEs. And I also agree on that. And you have many SMEs working in the agricultural sectors, and we have to design models that will help them to thrive, not only by giving them financial means, but we have also to create market from them. We have also to create a kind of ecosystem around smallholder farmers and those SMEs in order to make them able to grow. And as a result, to contribute to the transformation and the growth of the continent. And I would like also to think to talk about something very important when it comes to food in Africa, because we need to promote Africa historic low water consumption and high fiber crops. I mean, if you look back 50 years ago, African were not consuming rice. Rice was imported by people out of Africa. So this is something we have also to change our consumption habits and to go back to those like to those crops that are consuming low water, as I said, and give more fibers and are more rich in terms of calories. And finally, we have also to support, enhance the industrial synergies and the complementarities among African countries. And in that spirit, all the industrial project that we have between OCP and the government of Ethiopia, for instance, or the government of Nigeria and Ghana to build a fertilizer plant in those countries, this is a kind of synergies we have to promote based on each country natural resources or each country assets. So this is one of, let's say, the needs in order to transform our agriculture. But for me, the more important key lever is the capacity building. We will not be able to transform our agriculture, and this transformation will not be sustainable if we are not educating and training our youth, if we are not creating specific program dedicated to the science of agriculture. And in that spirit, OCP have created a university called University Mohammed VI Polytechnic. And this institution is focusing on applied research and innovation and is oriented towards Africa. We have also a big department of R&D, and I do believe that this is also something very important, and we are not focusing on it as we should as far as the agriculture is concerned. We need R&D in agriculture. If you look at what is happening in US, for instance, or in other countries that have very strong agriculture, the R&D part of it is one of the key success factors. And then we have also to promote innovation and entrepreneurship. We need to support our youth. We need to have strong innovator and entrepreneurial ecosystem in order to make our youth entrepreneurs able to solve the problem that the continent will face. And then we can also be able to create jobs. I've mentioned in my introduction that jobs creation will be also an issue to face and to overcome. And by supporting innovation and entrepreneurship, we will be able to do so.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. So, a lot of things that need to be done. I like the whole, eat what we produce, right? Make sure we do that. And then the whole R&D space and innovation and entrepreneurship. We have a lot of questions from the audience. So let me try to take a few. Dr. Alili, let's start with you. There is a question about how you talked about, promoting local manufacturing and import substitution. There was a big question around, Nigeria has tried that before, not always in some cases successful, in others not. So what is Nigeria going to do differently to make sure that this time promoting local manufacturing actually works in the country? Dr. Alili, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Sorry, just trying to unmute myself.
No worries.
It's one lesson we have learned from this pandemic is that it's has become absolutely necessary to be able to do some things by ourselves. And I'm glad Mohammed also mentioned the need to be able to provide some of the food that we eat. Now, you can imagine if we depend solely on import of food. During the pandemic, every country will take care of its own people first. And exports of food, the face mask, PPE, and so on were banned. So if we are not able to, if we have to store, if we have to wait on other countries, for instance, to provide something as simple as face mask for us, I'm sure in the short term we are all dead because they will be using their face mask. They are not exporting it because we do. So I think we have done it in the past, yes, to say import substitution does not work, but Karim also talked about some of the reasons why they didn't work. The enabling environment for these things were not there. We also have access to financing. Rates of interest rates in Nigeria is very high if you want to go into manufacturing as well. So some of these things are things that we are trying to address this time. If you have a market for 200 million people to be able to do something that you consume, now we have seen that it does not always pay to depend on other countries for everything that you need. You can, if the pandemic were not COVID-19, let's assume it was malaria, and we're susceptible to malaria, and every single anti-malaria tablet that we have will have to come from other countries. Now we won't be talking of how many people would have been dead because we can't produce it. So there are certain things that we have to. I'm not saying everything that we import we will be able to, but there are certain essential things that we must be able to produce. And once we can put in place an enabling environment for this, allow people to have access to finance, and then I think the rest will be doing. Now we are even doing we are doing roads to make sure that connectivity will be easier. You can move food from one part of the country to the other, or move any other item from one part of the country to the other. So we're doing that. And we should be able to provide, like I said, some of the things that we need, not all. Thank you.
Okay. No, thank you. Another, probably maybe just to build on that, because there was another question related, which is part of it is also we need to, as a country, attract foreign direct investment, especially in a sector like the oil and gas sector. So one question that was raised was, how competitive is Nigeria today? We know that what's going to happen. We're going to see, a lot more competition between countries for the limited resources. So how competitive is Nigeria in the oil and gas space? And what does Nigeria need to do to become even more competitive in this post-COVID world?
In the oil and gas space, we are doing a lot. And one of the things is to be able to even bring down the cost of production of this oil from what it is. We have one of the highest in the world. We're doing things to be able to reduce the cost of production. We are doing a lot to ensure that there's security in that area. We are doing a lot to ensure that those who produce, the foreign investors that produce in Nigeria, don't have too much to complain about. So we are becoming more competitive. There is a lot of reforms that is going on. And by the time these reforms are done, then Nigeria will be very, very competitive in all these other sectors. These are all structural reforms that we are taking on headlong. And we are not sort of underestimating them. We know they are critical to inviting, to getting foreign direct investment into the country. And we are doing, what we can to make sure that we remain on top of the game.
All right, a number of reforms, but including, reducing the cost of production, which I think, having spent a lot of time looking at the sector in Nigeria, is actually something that needs to be done. So thank you for that. Aida, maybe we come to you because there are a number of questions here on sort of SME, women-led SMEs. One question around, what are the kind of winning policies or practices you've seen on the public sector, on the private sector side, to make sure that these SMEs, especially the women-led ones, have access to procurement opportunities as people diversify the supplier base? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It starts with, number one, creating a forum and an opportunity where people and entrepreneurs, be it women entrepreneurs or male entrepreneurs, have access to resources to enable to help them grow their business. The closer we get to them, we realize that, as I said earlier, access to finance to grow their business is a challenge. Tools to formalize their business is fundamental. Structure to put in place by the regulatory framework to make it easier for them to get, to enter the formal financial ecosystem are fundamental. And this is why we believe that, as Visa, we have a role to play in making sure that we create this forum to make a resource available to SMBs, and I talked about that a little bit earlier. We believe that we also should partner with all the stakeholders, in our ecosystem, like, governments, to put in place, the right policies and structures in place that would foster more enablement of these fintechs and giving them access, again, not only to finances, but also to formal support, resources and financial support. So it is a combination of these factors that are going to play a key role. We believe also that certainly loans and partnership with NGOs are going to be fundamental, because this is where I believe the rubber meets the road, and this is in line with the commitment that we've done. But the one thing that I want to re-emphasize here, Asha, is, as we look at, the more resilient SMEs today in the context of the crisis, and we see which one are the ones who have been bouncing back or resisting better to the crisis, these are the ones who have truly embraced digitization of their, their flows and their activities, and digitization of their payments. And this is why I relentlessly come back to this, because we believe that this is going to be a key factor moving forward.
Absolutely, and for me, not just SMEs, we found that the companies and the countries, by the way, that have been, more digitally advanced have fared better. Right, and we think that actually going forward, as we talked about foreign investment, one of the criteria foreign investors are going to look at is how digitized is the country, because we will have another pandemic someday. The question is just when.
Absolutely.
That's one. One thing you didn't talk about is credit rating systems, and there's a question about, is that a space Visa plays in at the moment, and what are you doing with that in Africa?
This is definitely a space where we see an opportunity for acceleration and growth in Africa altogether. It is a segment where, for different reasons, be it from an understanding on how credit works, or from limitation that governments are putting in place, preventing the expansion of credit altogether. There is an opportunity again to accelerate this space in the payment ecosystem. It is about creating the awareness and the education around the benefit of it. And then it's also, again, making sure that the policies in place fosters such solution. Just to give you an example, in some of the markets in the region, the regulator warrants that credit is associated or tied to a bank account. And this is not necessarily a mandatory requirement for it to be efficient, right? So there's got to be ongoing dialogue and engagement to make sure that all stakeholders, feel comfortable with the framework in place and allow further credit solutions to be made available to consumers and players in the ecosystem.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that, Aida. Mohammed, let's come to you. Let's shift a bit and talk on this question about AI and digital transformation. You spoke quite a bit about the role the telco sector can play in that space. There are clearly opportunities and big benefits, as we discussed. But like somebody mentioned, in the chat, there's some risk, right? There's risk on jobs, and there's some other risk, on security, personal security issues. From your perspective, how do we balance that? The opportunity versus the risk that these AI and digital transformations create for the continent.
That is a misperception. Even we remember some time ago when robotics, for example, were introduced. A lot of people were worried, okay, what about the jobs that we're going to lose to robotics when they start moving into production lines and manufacturing floors and so on and so forth. And what we have realized is that, yes, maybe there are a few jobs that will be directly impacted, but then the robotics themselves are creating a massive job employment on the side. You need companies to produce these robotics, you need companies to design them, there will be so many other consultants, advisors who will think about their work, how they operate, and so on and so forth. So there is always a job creation that goes on the back of that. So artificial intelligence, for example, yes, is when you start asking the machines to do the thinking rather than you do that. Does that mean you're gonna lose maybe the job of the person who's sitting down and trying to do the thinking? The output probably, or the whole purpose of this AI is to make sure that the output is more efficient, that the output has a better quality, maybe even. Once again, we look at the direct impact of that on the job market, but we also don't see that the creation of that technology recruits a lot of jobs, that the expansion of that technology, where can it go, the creation of that technology of new fields or sectors or jobs or companies or opportunities, that's where also the other jobs are being created to help AI. But yes, security-wise, also you have to be careful about the security of data and information, all of that, but all that is ensured. Look now at cloud computing. A lot of people were afraid, oh, am I going to put my data at the cloud? Look at what happened with that company. I don't want to mention in the US when they start having leakages and this and that. No, my data is not protected. Yeah, maybe those are certain cases that happen, but then there are tons of other cases of where that cloud storage or cloud computing or cloud data centers have really made things efficient for companies and people and individuals and so on and so forth. So it's nothing risk-free. You create a technology, there is some risk associated with it. That's why you need to look at that and to cover it from all aspects. I am much more comfortable with cloud and all of that than I used to be, like maybe a long time ago when it was introduced. You just need to make sure that that technology you are creating does that. Unfortunately, in Africa, we are always behind when it comes to these technological advances, maybe because of the investment needed, maybe because of the concerns we have on the security element. That's a key thing, how we look at things in Africa, maybe because we don't have the enabling environment, the enabling infrastructure to just put that technology on, unlike other countries in Europe or the US, for example. But I also saw one question about like a major data center in Africa. You know, great ideas. Are they practical? I don't know. Would the governments in Africa agree where to put that data center? Would they open their borders so that fiber can be laid down and everything can be connected with everything, the MNOs, the government? But I know, for example, in Nigeria, the banking sector have to have their own data center. This have to have, MNOs like to have their own data centers. So you need a massive mentality shift. You need people to think differently with these technological advances. They exist, but they're not going to provide the solution on their own. You need the governments, you need the people, you need the user to start thinking that, you know what, these technological advances will eventually provide the solutions that we need, even though there could be some issues at the start of it.
Thank you, Mohammed. And you're absolutely right. You know, we did a piece of work looking at, you know, we call it future of work, and we looked at it around the world. And we did the analysis for South Africa in particular, and we're looking to expand it to Africa to understand. If you look at the impact of the fourth industrial revolution, you think of the impact of automation on jobs. What will that be? So jobs lost. But then on the other side, what kind of jobs are you going to gain, right? And everywhere we've looked at, including in South Africa, we found that you could gain many more jobs than you lose, to your point, right? Now, the trick, though, is we need to be prepared to gain those jobs, right? So how do we make sure that we understand what jobs will come out of it? How do we prepare people? What kind of training programs you need to put in place? What kind of sectors you need to put in place? How does the government and private sector work together to help prepare people for the jobs? Because I think the risk is if we don't do that, we'll get all the jobs lost, but very few of the jobs gained. So I think that's part of the challenge. Let's talk, Karim. You know, again, some questions on the ag front, of course, coming to you. You know, we talked about food production. We need to produce more ourselves, and then as Africa tried to, you know, make sure we have the logistics to get these across the continent, the storage facilities. How well prepared are we for that as a continent, right? We tend to export to other regions, or we tend to import from other regions, but not do much in terms of, you know, export and import within the continent. So how well prepared are we for that, and what's it going to take for us to get a lot more of the Pan-African trade going in the agriculture front?
I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we have noticed some progress, but of course we are not there yet. And the common issue I'm looking at or are facing is that we are still, except the big countries such as Nigeria or Ethiopia, where the market is that big that they can focus first on their own country before going in the neighboring countries. But other countries, mainly their local market is too small. So this is why the Africa Free Trade area is important. We need to start improving the intra-Africa trade. When you look at the figures, I mean, the African intra-trade is something between 10 and 11%, where in Europe, for instance, is above 70%. And in Americas, it's also that figures. And we need to start there, because you're right, maybe we don't have the enough storage capacity, maybe we don't have the infrastructure, maybe we don't have the transportation means, but we need to start somewhere. And this is what we have tried to do since 2016 by having this small ecosystem approach where we have all the actors of the supply chain. We have the farmers, we have the input providers, finance institutions, insurance, and more importantly, the output buyer, the guy who will buy at the end of the day the production, and we try to transform it. And by having those small projects, and we have done many in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Ethiopia, and it's very successful, because then you notice that the farmers increase its productivity by more than 40%, And of course, he is also increasing their revenues. But we are still doing this at a small scale. We are talking about projects with less than 60,000, 70,000 farmers, when you know that in Africa we have more than 800 million farmers. So the point here is how we can scale up this. And when we want to scale up, then you need, it's much more complex, of course, and you need big players to enter in. And big players, first we have to talk to African players, but we can also talk to American players. I think that we have a lot to learn from them. We have a lot to share with them. So my point here is that we are not ready on the field, but first we need to be all to agree on how we can work together, how we can design those models, because don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that one model will be perfect for all the countries and all the crops we have in Africa. I think that the approach is we have to sit down, to have people that are there. As soon as you have companies that are at one point de-risking the project or de-risking what we want to do, all the others are also coming, joining, and we do things. And by having this collective intelligence, having this, the way of working all together, then we can start doing things that will have big impacts. But first, for me, if we want to be successful in that, the key element is the PPP, the private public partenariat sector. We need to work closely between the private sector and the public sector. So far, it's either the governments that are trying to do things for agriculture, or the private sector trying to do things also alone in his side. We need to bring all those people. We need to bring also non-profitable organization and many other foundations and so on and so forth. But for me, it's a collective approach that needs to be done. And we have to sit down and start designing, thinking, and implementing. And once again, one project will not be successful everywhere, but I believe that the approach that we are having is the one that we should use in all the countries of our continent.
Thank you. Let me ask maybe one final question to Dr. Alade, then I'll come back to each of you for your closing statements. And this is about healthcare. So we know, it's first and foremost a health crisis. So it's a question about, when you look at the economic sustainability plan, how much of healthcare is a focus in the plan, investment in healthcare, especially in primary healthcare centers. Can you just talk a bit about, how much the plan focuses on that to come out of the crisis?
Thank you. The healthcare, there's a lot of support for the healthcare, given what we have seen. Part of it is funding of the pharmaceutical sectors to be able to produce local drug. I just mentioned malaria and some of these other things that we need. So there's funding, there's access to finance for them to be able to procure equipment and raw materials so that these things can be produced locally. We have also seen other things apart from pharmaceuticals. Investment now will be going into our primary healthcare and some of our hospitals, even the teaching hospitals that we have. There's money or there's fund that will be available to be able to upgrade the centers. I mean, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from this COVID thing. We have seen how weak our healthcare system is, and to be able to upgrade them to something, just like you said a while ago, the question is when next is when is the next pandemic? When next are we going to have this kind of problems? And then we are then caught again, not fully prepared. So we do have funds available. The economic sustainability plan is looking at that sector fully, from pharmaceutical to others wanting to even establish private clinic. We are asking them for, there's a whole 100 billion for that sector, for those who want to go into hospitals, private sector, not necessarily even government. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to all my panelists. So as we close, I have one question for all of you. Right? I'd just like to hear it as your closing statement. It's, if we're in the middle of the pandemic, there's all the negativity, the number of cases, number of jobs losses. We've talked quite a bit about what's it going to take, to emerge from this stronger. How optimistic are you that we're going to get there? Right. So maybe Mohammed, I'll start with you and then go through this. So how optimistic are you?
Very optimistic. It's not the first time that Africa faces a challenge. It's not going to be the last time. The difference this time is that this challenge has affected everybody in the world. I was always amazed by the US being land of opportunities and the American dream, and you can go and do whatever you want in the US. Then I look at Africa and you see the challenges that we have, you see the lack of infrastructure, you see the lack of the basic needs that people require, whether on power or access to clean water or security or. But I always say that these challenges create opportunities. These challenges create venues for improvement. These challenges create hope for people that for a better future, especially with the telecom sector have opened up the eyes for everybody to see how everybody else in the world is living. When you as an African, you go online and you see how somebody in Germany or in the US is living and going around, you start requesting from your government for change and you ask for improvements and you start saying, why not me? So that's, I think, was key to create that dialogue. And as I said earlier, investment is there. People see the potential in Africa. All what they need for is an enabling environment and a protected environment that they will feel that, yes, we can put our money here, we will make our returns, and then we will be able to take it back. Policies have to be put to ensure that those I think principles are there. And trust me, Asha, Africa, as I said earlier, I don't see a reason why we can't be where we have to be.
Awesome. Love it. Very optimistic. Aida, same question to you. How optimistic are you?
I am tremendously optimistic, Asha. I am amazed at the resilience that we have demonstrated throughout this crisis. There isn't a single partner I speak to who is not, thinking ahead, forward-looking, and looking at how they will transform and looking at, turning these difficult times into future opportunities. Specifically in our industries, we see some new entrants coming in with amazing technology. These fintechs are coming in offering amazing solutions both to issuer, to banks, to merchants, creating second to none capabilities. We were talking earlier about credit, but do you know that we have fintechs that now can determine the credit worthiness or the work of someone due to the usage of their mobile, phone, creating amazing opportunities. So for me, it is truly about how do we get Africa ready for digitization? How do we enable further, digitized payment? But this can only happen if we come together as an industry, right? And we create the proper framework, we enable the stakeholder in the space to embark into that journey. And we are more than ever committed to do so. And the trend started before COVID-19. It is accelerated and there's no stop. We can't go backwards, and it is an exciting time ahead for Africa in that space.
Awesome. Thanks, Aida. Karim, your thoughts?
I mean, yeah, there is no point to ask this question. I'm definitely optimistic. I think the question here is how do we learn from what is happening, how we take lessons from that, and we take actions. I mean, as far as we are concerned and the agriculture is concerned, since the pandemic started, we have seen many countries where we are used to operate that they have really changed the way they were approaching the agriculture, even though before it was the case. But during the pandemic, just one figure to mention, I mean, there were this Maputo agreement. It was, I think, in 2000, around 2000. And all the head of state have agreed to dedicate 10% of their budget to the agriculture. And it was not reached. I think the maximum was something like 5 to 6%. And during this pandemic, I don't have the final figures, of course, but according to all the communication and the exchange I had, I presume that we are probably around 11 to 12, because that was a necessity, because the food security was the first priority to solve. So my point here is, at the end, what this pandemic have done is the pandemic put us in a situation when we had to react, and to react quickly. And what have been done is a quick reaction, but also a collective reaction. And this is exactly what I was talking about, is the public sector was talking to private sector, and we have all the main stakeholder of all the value chains in the agriculture starting talking to each other, having webinars, conference, and all these things, and we have made things happening. I mean, I have an example in mind. It's the what we call le plan urgence riz in Ivory Coast. Now we are working, and they had an issue regarding the rice stocks, and we will be able now to produce the equivalent of 20% of the year country consumption. This has never been done before. So the pandemic pushed us to find solution in order to overcome and to overpass that. So once again, I'm fully convinced that we will be able to make it. But once again, for me, the more important thing is, of course, as I said, the capacity building. We have to invest a lot in our youth population. We have to look at R&D. And also we have maybe to take advantage from this panel and this seminar and the organization to ask also the US company to start coming and investing and helping us in order also to design and implement what we need to do. We have to first, of course, start within Africa, but we cannot make it without all the others. And being in this CCA, I think it's also an opportunity for us to call for, let's say, initiative or project that could be run by Africans and Americans.
Perfect. And last but not least, Dr. Alade, I was like any other Nigerian, you're optimistic.
Thank you. I'm very, very optimistic, very optimistic. And I believe that what we are doing now to confront the problem is, safeguarding government revenue. In Nigeria, a lot of things we're doing is to make sure we block leakages and enhance the government revenue that we have. We are also safeguarding lives and safeguarding livelihood. With faithful or effective implementation of these policies, we will definitely come out of it. Maybe not even as bad as we think. If we do that. And I also believe that if we continue with some of the structural reforms, the policy reforms that we have, we will be able to attract foreign direct investment. It's not as if we can pull through alone. We do need foreign direct investment, and we will be able to then turn all this crisis into opportunities. Yes, lots of vulnerabilities. We are vulnerable in many sites, but this can be seen as opportunities for investment. And once we do the right things, I'm sure other people will come. I love the USAID thing, that their partnership with Africa is a journey to self-reliance. That exactly is what we want, and that's what we're working towards. Thank you.
There we go. On that note, all I can just thank you all for what I think was a great and very insightful panel. Thanks, everybody. And let me hand over to Flora from here.
Thank you, Aisha.
Yes, Ache, let me just thank you for your excellent moderation of this outstanding panel. To all of the panelists, thank you so much for sharing information about some of these key sectors that are critical for post-COVID recovery. You all, in your optimistic statements, though peppered with a reality about the kinds of things that need to happen, but your optimism really confirms for me and for Corporate Council on Africa that the continent is ready for partnership and is resilient. And if we all come together in the kind of public-private partnerships that Karim mentioned and Dr. Alade and others, that we will get past COVID-19, and then we'll actually go to perhaps newer and better places in the kind of post-COVID economic partnerships that we can have. Let me now turn to a colleague and friend, Riva Levinson of KRL. She's the president and CEO of KRL International, to provide us some closing remarks. Riva, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Flori and Carla and Akego for your leadership. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Riva Levinson. I'm the CEO of KRL International. I am also an author and a columnist, and for those who promised to virtually connect today, I want to thank you for all the amazing feedback that you provided to me. It's made me a better writer. I want to thank our distinguished panel, Mohammed, Karim, Dr. Alade, and Aida, for giving us so much to think about. And our moderator, Acha, who I wish could turn his video on, but I don't think he can, for opening the session with one of my favorite words, to reimagine, meaning to imagine again anew, to form a new concept, to recreate, because that's what this week's CCA Leadership Forum has been all about, reimagining the world that we find ourselves in. The COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the truth that a novel virus infection anywhere is a contagion everywhere. And so too, the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed Black man whose last breath was seized by the knee of a white police officer, has shown another universal certainty that in our globalized age, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. What are our responsibilities to our organizations, public and private, to our communities, to our African partners? And across the ocean, what are the responsibilities of African governments to their citizens and to their next generation? Big questions, I know, and I want to thank the CCA for providing this forum to discuss it. But for now, with the remainder of my time, I want to turn to Acha's 9 points of reimagination of Africa. And with his permission, I'm going to add 2 and ask consideration if McKinsey might add them to the list. My number 10, so remember there were 9 folks, Acha had 9. So my number 10 would be to remove ourselves from the silos that we all tend to operate in. The government silo, NGO silo, local business, foreign business, the donors, multilateral, civil society, media, we're often pitted against one another and we miss out on the opportunities to collaborate. Fortunately, in the time of this health emergency, many such barriers have been broken, but they need to stay so. These barriers need to remain in a continuous state of disrepair. Let me give you an example in Ghana, where the private sector, local and foreign, stood up the West Africa private sector coronavirus platform to support the government's COVID-19 response, filling in the gaps in critical areas like the scaling up of testing, coordination on regulatory policy to spur recovery, and acting as an echo chamber for public education. This multi-sector, multi-affiliation effort is the first time that domestic and foreign businesses, including representatives of the informal economy, have come together to help design interventions. It's a big deal and it needs to stay on. My second to Acha's list, and excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of water, is that we do all we can as a collective to vest young Africans in their democratic institutions, to believe that they can make a difference through their participation in the political process, and that the national, local, and regional governments represent their interests. Afrobarometer recently completed a survey of attitudes across the continent about impact to COVID-19, and they found that there was strong institutional support for democracy and accountable governance, and that when there's trust in leadership, a country was more likely to see a community-based mobilization to respond to the pandemic. And we all know community-based mobilization is the key. Their data also showed the ineffectiveness of heavy-handed security forces and the concern that COVID-19 not be an excuse to take away long-sought democratic freedoms. And for me, I'd like to shout out today to Malawi, if folks are following the news, which on Monday conducted its rerun of its national and presidential elections demanded earlier this year by an unprecedented Supreme Court decision. It was peaceful, participatory, and it appears that a unified opposition has since won by more than 50+1%. So Acha, over to you. I hope McKinsey will consider these ideas. They're not data fed, but they come across from the comments on the many columns that I write. And in closing, I want to thank all of my panelists and the CCA for this opportunity. I want to urge everyone to watch tomorrow's closing session. Both President Nana Akufo-Addo and President Kenyatta will join. And I also want to challenge this virtual audience to create their own points of reimagination and share them with the team at CCA so we can continue this conversation. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure.